AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. Today, I'm privileged to welcome back an old friend and former colleague who's both. Nick Reynolds got his PhD from Oxford. After that, he joined the Marine Corps. And after that, he joined CIA, where he was a case officer, a curator, and a historian. After retirement, he's been a professor, a researcher, and an author. And his book, Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence, is really the premier work on the subject. At AFIO's first in-person event in late February 2025, we invited a couple of well-known historians to come back and help us remember the history of intelligence. And Nick was one of those historians. And the audience really liked his presentation. And so I asked Nick to come back today and do a video recording so that we could share it with a wider audience. Nick, welcome back to you now.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. We'll just describe to the audience that I'm actually going to be the guy moving the slides. So we'll move the slides and then I'll invite Nick to present.
Okay. So let me tee this up a little bit. What I'm doing here basically is focusing on two aspects of American intelligence in World War II that show how the profession took shape and set the foundations for the post-war period. So the very first thing we've got to do is look at American intelligence before World War II. And that was a time at which, or during which, there were no three-letter intelligence agencies. I like to call it the cottage industry phase of American intelligence. It's one in which there are isolated craftsmen, especially code breakers, working on their own. Next slide, please. Some of these craftsmen were incredibly talented and successful and did things pretty much, invented procedures and had enormous results with very few resources. Herbert O. Yardley is one of the first men to become a prominent American codebreaker. He starts out as in the State Department code room before World War I, gets practice after hours breaking President Wilson and Colonel House's private code, serves in the Army during World War I. After World War I, he's remembered for running something called the Black Chamber, which was a townhouse in New York, and it was the Department of State and the Department of War together, and they were breaking basically diplomatic codes that were useful in negotiations, especially disarmament codes in the naval disarmament codes in the 1920s. Next, please. At the end of the 1920s, we have Henry L. Stimson coming on to the scene and getting involved with code breaking in a negative way. He's on the left here on this slide, and he is a grand old man of American statecraft. He's been Governor General of the Philippines. Now he's Secretary of State. He will, before he ends his career, have been Secretary of War twice. And when he comes to Washington at this point in 1929, he says he's briefed about the Black Chamber, and he says, shut it down. We can't have this. And he famously says, gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail. And so Yardley is sent packing. The State Department cuts off its funding. However, next slide, please. However, the Army is willing to carry on. And the primary Army code breaker is William F. Friedman, who's a very interesting character. And I in my research, I find him one of the more sympathetic characters in this whole story. He's born in Russia, comes to the U.S. as a small child, happens to be Jewish, which is held against him sometimes. But, it seems, if anything, it seems to be a driver for him to excel even more at this work. He is a natural at the work of code breaking. And when the Black Chamber is shut down, Friedman goes to New York and says, hey, I'm going to keep these files. So basically loads them onto a truck and brings them back to Washington. And he and his men and a couple of women operate on the National Mall, where the Army and the Navy have the Pentagon. It's basically between the Lincoln and Washington memorials, two very ugly buildings about 5 stories high, which thankfully are no longer there. But anyway, Friedman's gang has a group, as an office in this complex, and there they break codes, primarily focusing on Japanese codes, and they do it basically with pencil and paper. So they have yellow pads and they stare at groups of codes looking for patterns until they discern those patterns, and then they eventually, a remarkable achievement, one of the code breakers reverse engineers the Japanese code machine. So basically on his own time in his garage, he's got the encrypted and the decrypted pieces of paper, right? So the as intercepted and then as broken, and he figures out how a machine would do this. And he's going to the hardware store, buying wires and tubes and whatnot. And after a year or two of work, again on his own time, he comes up with this fabulous machine, which essentially does what the Japanese code breaking machine, as constructed by Tokyo, does. It's just a phenomenal achievement. And I like to add to this story the guy who did it, Friedman's assistant Rowlett. So Rowlett during World War II is one of the primary code breakers, one of the most important American code breakers. And he's going somewhere around 1943, 44. And so, as many of you will know, when you go somewhere, often your clearances are passed. You're going to visit another command, and so there'll be a message that says what your clearances are, so that when you get there, you can get right to work. So they get ready to let's go on a trip. They want to pass his clearances, and they come to the realization that Rowlett has no clearances. And the reason he has no clearances is he started work in this field before there was a procedure for issuing clearances. So there wasn't a problem with Rowlett's clearances once they realized this, and of course he got the highest possible clearance. So there we are going into the war. We've started to break Japanese codes. And Mr. Stimson, next slide, please. Mr. Stimson comes back to Washington. So in the previous thing, he closes the Black Chamber, but now he's opening the door to code breaking. And his reasoning is basically, you're not dealing with gentlemen here. You're dealing with Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini. And so he is all in favor of code breaking in World War II. And he is a great sponsor of this undertaking. Next slide, please. So one of the important things that happens in World War II is that the Army comes up with a system for disseminating code breaking, the results of code breaking. And this gentleman here, Alfred T. McCormick, who's a New York lawyer, comes to Washington, brings a bunch of other New York lawyers, and he basically serves as a kind of mini directorate of analysis to create this product called the Magic Summary. And Friedman says this is a great product because before the war, what happened was if a cable was broken, then the decision maker just saw that cable, saw the raw text, the same text that the Japanese ambassador might see. And he would be handed the cable for 5 or 10 minutes, and then he'd be asked to give it back. And then the next day he would see another cable. So what McCormick does is he gives it context. There's a background, and Friedman says it's like shifting from looking at still pictures to seeing a movie. Now you actually can see a movie. You can see how events have progressed. You could see a reference to the message that appeared yesterday and you can see you see a little bit of background information about other trends that are involved. Next slide, please. So here is a sample. It's probably pretty hard to see for the viewers at home or in their office, but here is an actual, on the right is an actual magic summary, and up above is the introductory text, and then down below is the actual cable that is at the heart of this particular report. And these go on for something like, they can go on for up to 20 pages. And this is the lifeblood of American intelligence in World War II. This is the favorite reading of the decision makers, of the generals, MacArthur. You've got Eisenhower, you've got Marshall. The political decision makers are not quite as enthusiastic about this. President Roosevelt is not a great consumer of intelligence, but the warfighters are, and this makes tremendous difference to them as they're fighting the war. This particular one is about surrender negotiations in 1945, just a hugely important subject, and it shows how the Japanese are finally talking about negotiating an end to the war. Next, please. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that all that happened in World War II was code breaking. The other major event that happens in World War II has to do with human intelligence. And the most important character there is William J. Donovan, another New York lawyer. I hope you'll forgive me. I didn't make all this up. American intelligence in World War II was very largely staffed by lawyers. So he is less of a technocrat than the lawyers we talked about a minute ago. He's more a man of the world, as suggested here in this picture, where he's on an ocean liner, either getting ready to cross, or arriving in New York after an Atlantic crossing. So he's a guy who has gone all over the world. He shows up. He's like an unofficial envoy or a fact finder, and he asks for. So here he is, a partner in a law firm and a World War I war hero, and he'll go to Mussolini's office in the mid-30s and say he wants an hour on the Duce's calendar, and he gets it. So they sit down and they talk about how Duce views the world, and then Donovan comes back and he compares notes with others in his social circle and professional circle in New York. So it's kind of amateur intelligence. It's a bit above. They're not just doing this because they have investments that they want to further. It's not like risk analysis. It's really they're interested in this for its own sake. And yes, occasionally there's some corporate interests involved, but basically they're men of the world, and that's what they're up to unofficially before the war, when there is no American intelligence, especially on the civilian side, to speak of. Next slide, please. So I've already talked about some of these basics, and that what Donovan did between the wars. And then when World War II starts, the British want Americans to have an intelligence establishment, something like theirs. And it's kind of like wanting a partner who you can do things with, a partner who will go on expeditions with you, who will undertake research with you, who you can share insights with. And so the British think Donovan is a great guy for this role, and they pressure FDR to appoint him. FDR eventually agrees. He becomes something called the Coordinator of Information in 1941, before the U.S. enters the war. And then in the middle of 1942, he becomes the director of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. And that's really what we remember him for. The U.S. finally has a Central Intelligence Agency, all lowercase at this point, but it's the first time that we see under one roof, you see two or three important functions that I'm about to talk about. And then the big challenge, once you come up with the idea for something like this, is finding the right people, because there's no LinkedIn, there's no database of people with particular skills. And there's also a limited pool of people with college educations. Something like 5% of the American population has a college education. Next slide, please. So we have three basic functions that OSS has. One is special intelligence, and that's really what we would think of now as the Directorate of Operations. And these are people who are in the business to collect secret information, to recruit spies. And once again, we see lawyers being considered as the right people to do this work, which kind of makes sense. I mean, you see lawyers like McCormick as people who analyze, who gather information and put it to use. You see lawyers with people skills who are able to find and recruit spies, and those spies might be American citizens who become officers, or they are foreigners who do traditional, what we now consider traditional spying. Dulles runs his own shop in Switzerland, kind of an independent intelligence agency on its own. William J. Casey gets his start in intelligence in World War II. Casey's a guy who's pretty well organized, and Donovan is not that well organized. So Casey comes to Washington and basically organizes the flow of business in his office, and then goes to Europe and does the same thing. And in the end, Casey is running his own operations into Germany in 1945 and does a pretty darn good job, considering that he basically starts from scratch. Next, please. So the second major kind of operation that I want to talk about is paramilitary. So they call it special operations in OSS. Here it's a little easier to find people to do the work. You go to the Army and the Marine Corps, and you find natural leaders. You find people who want to operate on their own. You find people who are comfortable operating in foreign settings. And here are two of the role models that we often talk about. There's Carl Eifler on the left, who leads Det 101 into the China-Burma-India theater and operates on his own in northern Burma. And then you see Peter Ortiz, who I'm writing a biography about. And Ortiz is a man who is a US citizen, but he grew up in France, and he is just ideally suited for operating behind the lines in 1944 in occupied France. Next, please. So we've talked about two major functions. We've talked about the paramilitary function, and we've talked about the intelligence function. The last function that we need to talk about is analysis. So you need to find people who are going to do, who will come to you with the skills to analyze the information that has been collected. And the answer to my question here, who's going to do it, tends to be, in World War II, tends to be historians. And they tend to be historians from Harvard and Yale, occasionally Princeton and other universities. And here are two of the leaders that are remembered: Jim Langer and Sherman Kent, of whom we will talk a little more in a bit. Next, please. So what makes them the right fit for this job? I talked a little bit about the economy at this time in the United States, and the fact that we don't have a large number of people with college degrees. And then you have to think about what information is at this time. And it's really something, it's on paper. There are precious few finding aids or ways of processing information. And so you really need the computer you need is basically in somebody's head. And the people who are used to processing this information and putting it to use, on the one hand, we've talked about lawyers, but if you want a little bit more perspective on the politics and the history, historians come with many of the same skills. So that's why you see people like these two gentlemen taking the lead in shaping the research and analysis branch of OSS. Next, please. I like to talk about them as knowledge workers with judgment. There's a new book that just came out. It's called Book and Dagger, and it focuses on RNA and shows how these particular men are suited for the challenge and what they do. Professor Graham pays particular attention to Sherman Kent. In wartime, he is chief of the Europe-Africa division of OSS, and she makes him stand out as a colorful character with unusual dress, language, and habits, like shooting bits. He's able to fire bits of chalk into the open mouths of snoring students on campus, and he brings these same habits to Washington, and does a terrific job of molding a workforce and getting that workforce to produce various analytic products. Next, please. So just how much OSS or RNA produced in World War II is open to discussion. My view is still that the code breakers, the magic summary is what the decision makers want over OSS products, but that's not to say that the OSS products were worthless. And we also need to bear in mind what's going on here, and that is that a whole group of people, a cadre, is being formed. The world of intelligence is being introduced to the Langers and Kents of this world, and they in turn are coming up with some analytic tradecraft that can be carried over in the post-war period. Both of them, Langer and Kent, come back to Washington after the war is over. OSS is disbanded, but they come back and they work in intelligence and eventually in CIA. One of the things so Kent's forte is estimates. He is in the Office of National Estimates, as it's called then. And interestingly enough, he calls for an intelligence journal. He says, if we're going to be a profession, we need a journal, just as historians have journals. So the Journal of American History, the Journal of Military History, the Journal of African Studies, say. And so now he says in the 1950s, we need a journal so that we can take our place as a profession. So then the result is still ongoing today, and it's this publication known as Studies in Intelligence in Classified and Unclassified Versions. So this helps to set the stage for what you need next in a profession, and that's a professional association, semi-independent professional association, and that will be AFIO, and that will come on the stage a little later. It will start in 1975. Next, please. So wrapping up my little overview of these two kinds of intelligence that I've talked about. At the end of the war, you see the commanders coming around to say thank you for the great gift that Friedman and Rowlett and the others gave them. And here you see General Eisenhower on the left coming to speak to Hoyt Vandenberg, Preston Quarterman, Frank Rowlett, and William F. Friedman. They're at Arlington Hall, which is still here, not far from where I'm sitting on Route 50 in Arlington. It's now the State Department Training Center, but at this point, it was the campus where the Army did its code breaking at the end of World War II. If you can look closely at Friedman, you see he's kind of out of it. And I'm not saying this to detract from Friedman. He remains a hero of mine. I'm saying this because code breaking takes a lot out of people, and he has been doing it nonstop for many years. And there's the pressure of the war added into it, and there's it's like doing a really it's like your life is solving really, really hard crossword puzzles or Sudokus, and Friedman is just worn out. That's not uncommon among great code breakers. I can name two or three others during World War II who were just worn out at the end of the war and really would take a couple or 3 years to recuperate. All right, so that's signals intelligence. And then next slide, please. So what happens to the other kind of intelligence? So non-signals intelligence, OSS, as I talked about. OSS itself does not survive the war. And what we see here is the farewell ceremony for OSS, which took place about where the Kennedy Center is now. there was an ice skating rink and a brewery, and that's where OSS, in the ice skating rink, that's where OSS had its auditorium, and the Washington staff gathered to say farewell to Donovan in September 1945. And you see here a silver plate that they gave him as a memento signed by the principals in OSS. And I mentioned the other day that one of the small benefits of being an intelligence historian is people call you to ask you questions. And I got a call asking if I appraised artifacts. And I said, no, not really, but would I authenticate an artifact? And I said, well, maybe unofficially. And it turned out to be this very platter here. And the gentleman who bought it, a collector, treated me to a lunch, and he had a briefcase and pulled out this wonderful silver platter, which he had acquired. It was actually bycatch, part of a larger collection that he purchased, and he realized its significance. So, next please. At the end of the war, it's President Truman who signs the death warrant for OSS. And he says, look, we are not going to continue this wartime organization, but we will continue its legacy. And he has this wonderful quote here: the peacetime intelligence services of the government are being erected on the foundation of the facilities and resources mobilized through the Office of Strategic Services during the war. And what I like to say is one of those resources is this priceless gift, the men and the women who Donovan attracted to Washington, who founded the modern profession of intelligence, and I place special emphasis on people like Kent and Langer. Next slide, please. So Donovan is actually not happy to leave Washington at the end of the war, but Truman tries to let him down as lightly as possible and invites him to the White House to give him a Distinguished Service Medal. And here we have a picture of the president pinning it on the general, and the general looking none too happy. I like to tell people that this picture is part of a series. There were 3 or 4 other shots snapped at the same time. And Harry Truman was a very good people person, and he's working on the general. You can see that he's got his mouth open here and appears to be saying something. And he is talking to the general, who's stiff and angry. And by the end of this film clip, he actually coaxes a smile out of the general, and they part on moderately good terms. But I'm going to leave it there and say that what Donovan did during the war set the stage for American intelligence in the Cold War and after. And one of his biggest contributions are the wonderful people that he attracted to Washington to work in intelligence. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. That was great.
My pleasure.
I want to thank my good friend Nick Reynolds for a very interesting and informative presentation. We hope to have other similar presentations in the future.
All right.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.